Here we go again.
Howdy my totally tubular gamers, and we're back with another ranking video, and today's gonna be a fun one. So we ranked all the GTA games, we ranked all the Red Dead and Midnight Club games. Today we're gonna be ranking one of the eras of Rockstar Games. We're gonna be ranking every game put out by Rockstar Games in the 2000s. Now Rockstar Games, they really don't need an introduction. GTA, Max Payne, Red Dead, Midnight Club, The Warriors, Manhunt, Manhunt 2. They've put out so many games in the 2000s that people have just come to absolutely beloved. If you're like me at all, the 2000s is a very special time for Rockstar Games, as they were just pumping out great game after great game after great game. They might not have developed all of them, but their logo was on so many good games in the 2000s, so many genre-defying, era-defining games that it was just too many to count, honestly. But here we are. We're going to look at all of them. I'm going to be looking at every single Rockstar game, whether they developed it or published it, that was put out from the year 2000 to 2009. Again, they did not have to develop it. They just had to have their label on it. And if they didn't develop it, I'll make it pretty clear who did. Over the last 2 or so years, I've really taken a stab to finish every single game that they've made in the 2000s. And yeah, I finally did. The last game I had left was Bully. Now, they actually put out quite a lot in the 2000s, and we're going to be ranking them based on basically everything. How does the gameplay hold up? How's the story? Do I have any fun memories with it, etc.? This is just my opinion, of course. I'd love to hear everyone's opinion on what their favorite Rockstar games are from the 2000s. You know, back when they put out more than just GTA 5. Nowadays, Rockstar Games really doesn't put out much, but back then in the 2000s, oh, it was just a golden era, honestly. We're also going to be combining all the versions of each game that came out in the 2000s into one entry. For instance, Midnight Club 3 has come out, I think, 3 times in the 2000s. All of that's just going to be one entry of Midnight Club 3. And I'll just be 100 for a second. This list was like stupidly hard to make. Ranking all of these games was incredibly difficult. I like just about every single one. Like, yeah, this was a really hard list to make, and I changed it up and remade it so many times. Really, this is just what I feel today, and realistically, tomorrow I could totally feel something different. So again, this is just what I feel today. Let me know your list down below. As always, like, share, comment, sub. I've got my own shark movie you can check out here. So I know exactly what is on your mind. I know exactly what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, I can think of what the best Rockstar games are in the 2000s, but what's the worst? What is the worst game that Rockstar Games put out from 2000 to 2009? Well, I wouldn't actually say this is the worst game Rockstar Games has put out in the 2000s. This is just kind of at the bottom by default. We have Beaterator, which was a music mixer released in 2009 by Rockstar Leeds in collaboration with Timbaland. It really is just a music mixer. I'm not someone who makes music, I make videos. The game was also released on iOS, but that version's not up, and the game's online services have been shut down, so it really is just kind of a basic music mixer. And I mean, I'll be real, you could download hundreds of programs to do this. You don't need a PSP game to do this. I'm sure this was probably ahead of its time, but yeah, just kind of by default it's at the bottom since it's not really a game. Again, I don't have any experience with this. I just know that if I didn't include it on this list, there'd be that one person in the comments saying I miss Beaterator. So here's Beaterator. Not really much of a game. It was before the SoundCloud rapper scene, but there you go. Alright, so for this entry we got a double feature. We got 2 Austin Powers games, Austin Powers Oh Behave and Austin Powers Welcome to My Underground Lair, both released for the Game Boy Color on the same day in 2000, and both were by Tarantula Studios, and of course were published by Rockstar Games. Tarantula Studios actually made the Grand Theft Auto Game Boy Color port and the Evel Knievel game. Now, even though these are 2 different games, I put them together since they're pretty similar. They came out the same day, they came out on the same console, they're both really just mini-game collections, and they're both ass. It doesn't matter if they're together or if they're apart, these are the worst games that Rockstar Games' name is attached to from the 2000s, and it's one of the worst games that Rockstar Games has ever published. Now, I love Austin Powers. I love all 3 of the movies. I think they're all hilarious. They're all great watches, and the music is great in all of them. But these games do not capture anything that made Austin Powers great at all. I mean, they have some attempts at humor and some quirkiness, but they just all fall flat on their face. And like I said like 30 seconds ago, these are just minigame collections. These games actually share minigames also. They have the same games in them. There's like a Pac-Man styled minigame, there's like a board game, there's a rock, paper, scissors game, and Austin Powers Oh Behave actually has one called International Man and Platform Game, which is like a platformer. These mini games are trash. They all control terribly. They're boring. They just don't have a lot going on. They're poorly developed, and there's not much to them. You play them for 30 seconds, maybe 2 or 3 minutes at most, and you've seen it all. Like, there's just really not a lot to go off of here. It's a terrible Game Boy game and just a horrible movie tie-in. Like, it's very clearly it was just a movie tie-in to make a quick buck, and there's just not much to it. These games really lack any passion or soul or creativity. There's just nothing here. These are terrible games that I do not recommend, even for Austin Powers enthusiasts like myself. Yeah, no, this is just bad. So our next game is actually a PS2 launch title. This is Surfing H3O, developed by Opus and put out by Rockstar in 2000. This is, if you couldn't tell, a surfing game. Now, when it comes to surfing games, the only real surfing game experience I have is with Kelly Slater Pro Surfer by Treyarch. That game was pretty fun, but it was just kind of a Tony Hawk Pro Skater clone, and it was limited to just surfing. But honestly, this game makes that game look great, because Surfing H3O, well, this just isn't it, Chief. This is not a very good game. It's pretty simple, and there's just not a lot going on here. This is supposed to be a pretty by-the-numbers, lame extreme sports game, but it's really not even that, as I'd really rather play almost any other extreme sports game. The biggest issue with this game is the controls. The controls are just a pain in the ass. They're incredibly clunky, stiff, and pushing in the analog sticks on a PS2 controller has just never been a good idea for like any game, let alone that being really important to the control. Now, the controls are super finicky, they just aren't precise enough, and they just feel really cumbersome. I had a ton of wipeouts because I was just fighting the controls, and then when you actually try to get decent at the controls, you realize there's really not much game here. There's like a tournament mode where you just kind of do tricks and go to the buoy and then kind of finish up. At least the music is pretty good. The music is what you'd expect for a game like this, and you know, I like it. It's that early 2000s, late 90s kind of punk rockish vibe. I like that. I can dig that. But I mean, nice music aside, there just really isn't much to the game. There's a multiplayer mode, there's some different characters, and yeah, you just kind of surf. It's like you go on the wave, you go to the buoy, you go back. I mean, there's really not all that much to it. And you know, for a game that takes place exclusively on the water, you would think it would look better. At least Pro Surfer looked pretty decent. I don't recommend really anybody plays any surfing game, especially nowadays, but you really don't want to play this one. I have no idea what Rockstar was thinking publishing this one. Like, it's just not really good at all. There's no reason to even try it, and I absolutely don't recommend it. So our next game is an interesting one. This is Wild Metal Country, developed by DMA Design, the old name for Rockstar Games, and it was published by Rockstar on the computer and Dreamcast in early 2000. It's also not very good. Wild Metal Country is a very obscure and just strange game to play on the Dreamcast, and really just in general, and it's kind of odd that Rockstar Games even developed this, let alone put it out at all. If you're just playing the game, there's basically no plot here at all. There's not even a setup. However, in the game's manual, and because I looked it up, there is actually a plot to this game. It's about you taking out these robots who have gone out of control, and that's pretty much it. Okay, so the story is pretty bland, but it's not just the story. The gameplay is also pretty bland. You're dropped into these big, open, dull-looking environments. You're in a tank, and you just kind of drive around destroying other robots, blowing them up, collecting these collectibles, and I guess exploring. There's really not a ton to this game in terms of gameplay. You really just drive around, blow stuff up, and collect stuff. The game really is as basic as it looks, and there's really not a lot going on here. The physics and controls are actually pretty decent, and blowing stuff up can feel nice, and I guess exploring has its moments, but this gameplay is largely uninspired and gets really boring really quickly. There's not even any music in the game. After even a short period of time, I found myself just falling asleep here. Like, yeah, it's cool, I get to blow stuff up in the tank, but there's just not really anything going on to make me care here. Like, this game just feels so lifeless and stale, and maybe that's the point since I'm fighting robots, but there's just not a lot going on here. The level design is very boring, it looks really boring, it's generally, again, very flat and bland, and there's just nothing really to the game. There's a reason it's so obscure and forgotten nowadays, because it's just really not that good, and I don't think it's worth playing at all. It's definitely a snooze fest. So our next game is Smuggler's Run, which was released for the PS2 in 2000. It was actually a launch title for the PS2. It was developed by Angel Studios, who would go on to be Rockstar San Diego, and they released it at the same time as Midnight Club 1. And you know, this game is actually very similar to the original Midnight Club. It has a very similar checkpoint-based gameplay loop. You basically drive around in this giant open area rather than on tracks, and you just go from checkpoint to checkpoint. Now, the driving in this game, it feels fine. The handling is okay when you're in a heavier car. The smaller and lighter cars just roll all over the place, but it's not the worst handling. Obviously, the key difference from Midnight Club is that it's not a city, instead it's deserts, valleys, and rivers. It's not very detailed and it feels just kind of open and barren. I really did think that the original city of Midnight Club 1 was pretty decent. This really just doesn't stand out. The map designs are just kind of bland, flat, and there's really not all that much going on, and there's not a lot of verticality either. Like, without thinking about the game for a few minutes, I really could not tell you any of the level design of any of the areas in this game. Like, it all just kind of meshes together and it was like in one ear, out the other. Something different from the original Midnight Club is that there's actually variety here. It's not just the checkpoint to checkpoint racing the original Midnight Club had. No, there's actually some variety. There's actually some different mission types here, like getting away from the police or, you know, being a smuggler on the run. There actually is some different missions here. Are they all that good? No, not really, but there's some variety here. The police are pretty unbearable here. They are just relentless. They will smash into you over and over and over, and it leads to a lot of trial and error because you can just get totally screwed over by the police in literal seconds to the point where you just have to start over, and it leads to you replaying missions a lot because of just some random instance of the police, and it just gets really frustrating. Combine this with the kind of shoddy handling and unpredictable physics, and you really just have a recipe for disaster here. The original Smuggler's Run, I don't really think it's all that good of a game. I mean, it wasn't like awful and it is playable, but I just don't think anybody should play it, and I'll just be 100 here. Play any of the other Midnight Club games. They're all better than this game. And as a little side note here, the game actually had a Game Boy Advance port 2 years later by Rebellion of all companies, and this, well, this is just even worse than the actual game, so that's not going to help its case. Don't play either of these. It really shouldn't be a surprise here that the worst GTA game in the 2000s is GTA Advance by Digital Eclipse, published by Rockstar Games, released for the Game Boy Advance. While it's not a terrible game, it definitely does have some issues. The game is like the first two Grand Theft Autos where it's from a top-down perspective, and of course with it being on the GBA, you gotta expect some compromises here. While it's not bad, it's very average or middling really at best. The story's alright in this game. It's a prequel to GTA 3 and takes place in Liberty City again. There's even some characters here from GTA 3 that make an appearance like 8-Ball, and that's cool, I guess. The story is pretty basic, and there's no cutscene since it's the GBA, it's just all text. Now when it comes to the actual gameplay, most of the game you really are just driving from one location to the other, or trying to escape like the cops. There is some on foot here, but the less said about the on foot, probably the better. A majority really is driving. The controls could be a lot better, as it does feel very unresponsive at times, especially in certain vehicles, and I mean, driving with the D-pad, it's going to take some time to get used to. And then when it comes to the presentation, it was just like, okay, the graphics are alright for the GBA, but it can get really stuttery, especially when you're driving at fast speeds, and that just adds to the unresponsiveness. The music is just really annoying. There is music in this game, but it does get pretty old pretty quickly as there are no radio channels. It just plays one track the whole time you're in a certain car, which, yeah, it gets annoying. Look, I cut this game some slack because it is on the GBA, and it does have some good elements to it, but coming back all these years later, it's really not that great. And these days, I don't recommend anybody try it out, as it's just way too dated for its own good. It's more dated than, like, the original GTA games. And I don't think anybody should be playing it, especially nowadays. So here's a Rockstar game you'll actually probably recognize, Manhunt 2 by Rockstar London, primarily released in 2007. Now Manhunt 2, they really looked at what made Manhunt Manhunt. It was a lot of violence, a lot of gore, a lot of shocking, really messed up situations, and decided that they were going to double down on it. They were going to make Manhunt 2 maybe like the most violent game of all time. It was actually rated AO for a spell, and you know, I can definitely say Manhunt 2 is a very, very violent game. It's probably the most violent game on this list. However, violence doesn't equal quality, and I think that Manhunt 2 actually has a multitude of issues with it outside of its violence. Don't get me wrong, the violence is great, and to start off on a positive, the executions are fantastic. These are some of the most violent, gory executions I've ever seen in a video game. This is like one of the most violent games ever made. Not even close. It is out of control with its violence. But when it comes to the actual game, I think that there is a lot to be desired here. And I actually did like a full 20-minute review of this game a couple years ago, but I'll summarize some of the points I made there. The story has you playing as a new character, Danny, and he's actually locked up in an insane asylum. He also has amnesia and doesn't really remember anything. He's with his buddy Leo, and the two of them escape the asylum after a crazy thunderstorm, and they're just kind of trying to figure out what in the hell happened in Danny's past and try to get away from all this bad shit. The story, I think, is a huge downgrade from the first game, and I didn't actually like it very much. It starts off interesting enough, but the twists in this game, I think the twists just straight up suck. And I didn't think the story or the characters were very good, and then the atmosphere of this game just completely missed the first game. The first game had an amazing, scary atmosphere to it. This game, absolutely not. I think it just drops the ball completely with its atmosphere. When it comes to the actual gameplay, it plays decently similar to the original game. You are hiding in the shadows, taking out people quietly, and you can get into some fistfights or fights with weapons, and of course guns eventually. Now, when you're just hiding in the shadows, taking people out stealthily, and doing these gruesome executions, I think it is actually pretty decent. It really does actually kind of capture the magic of the first game. Unfortunately, Manhunt 2 is just bogged down with way too much BS that is not this. Whether it's the terrible hand-to-hand combat or the awful gunplay, the rest of Manhunt 2's gameplay is just not very good. Seriously, the hand-to-hand sucks in this game. Even when you have a weapon, it's just not very good. It's super clunky, and it's like the Warriors came out a couple years before this, and that game had way better hand-to-hand than this. This just isn't good. And then the gunplay, the less said about it, the better. Honestly, even GTA, like the older GTA games, have better gunplay than this, and the frame rate just tanks most of the time and kills whatever challenge and atmosphere you had going on with Manhunt 2. The game is also nowhere near as challenging or long as the first game. It took me maybe half the time it took me to finish the first game, and the controls are just as clunky. Really, it's just not worth playing Manhunt 2 nowadays. Look up the gory executions, get grossed out, and move on with your life. That's really all I gotta say about Manhunt 2. It's just not worth playing. So our next game is another interesting one. It is The Italian Job, based on the 1969 film of the same name, and it was developed by Pixelogic. It was put out on the PlayStation, and it came to North American markets in 2002 by Rockstar Games. Yeah, PS1 game in '02. Now, I'll be 100 with you, I've actually never seen the original movie. I know about the reboot with Mark Wahlberg, but let's not talk about that. This game does follow the movie very closely from what I understand, and it does actually have a number of set pieces play out that are from the movie. Now, obviously, a lot of the movie is car chases or something going on in a car, so naturally this is a driving game. You spend the entire game in the car, and most of the time you are driving from point A to B, but occasionally you do have to tail someone or destroy someone, like knock them off the road or something along those lines. The driving in this game is actually pretty solid. It does feel nice. And I thought that a lot of the cars had a decent weight to them. I did notice the collision detection can be a little shoddy at times, and you just kind of get stuck on stuff like most PS1 driving games. And when you go airborne, it really can get kind of questionable, and the physics can be so-so. But also, it is a PS1 driving game, so you know, I'll give it a little pass there. Now, when you aren't just chasing someone, or when you're trying to get from point A or B, you got the cops and the mafia after you, and these guys are a real pain in the dick. Seriously, they do not leave you alone in this game. They are ruthless. Their pathfinding is actually pretty decent too. It was just really difficult sometimes to get them off your ass, and that's probably the biggest challenge of the game, is trying to get them off you or making the time limit. And this game can actually get pretty challenging, especially towards the end. You'll have to replay missions a couple times to really get a feel for them, or you'll just get lucky. But if you beat every mission in either your first or second attempt, this game is actually really short. Like, it's like the length of the movie. Seriously, you can beat it in like 2.5 hours. There's a sandbox mode here, and there's even a multiplayer mode, but I don't really have anything to comment on those. The game is fine enough. Maybe I'd like it a lot more if I had seen the movie. The movie came out like 30 years before the game, which was really odd, and again, releasing a PS1 game in '02 was a ballsy move. Yeah, the game was fine enough. If you really like the movie, I guess maybe check it out. Otherwise, you could probably just skip it. So here is one of the more forgotten games on the list. Here is State of Emergency, developed by VIS Entertainment and published by Rockstar Games for the PS2 in 2002. State of Emergency was very different from what people were expecting Rockstar Games to follow up with after Grand Theft Auto 3. See, Grand Theft Auto 3 came out shortly before State of Emergency, and even though Rockstar didn't actually develop this game, people really thought this was the follow-up to GTA 3 and were very disappointed immediately. And if you couldn't tell, this game is nothing like GTA, like at all. It is a beat 'em up. It's like if they brought River City from the NES and put it on the PS2. It is just a straight up beat 'em up. It's very linear, very somewhat open environments, but not really. And there really is only one objective, and that's just to defeat everyone. Whether you're beating them up with your fists, or you find a weapon on the ground and you pummel them into the ground with it, or you just straight up find a gun and start gunning people down, that's the objective of State of Emergency. You're just kind of killing or smashing everyone's brains in. There's not a lot of depth here, there's not a lot of complexity, and the game doesn't really offer all that much. You're just kind of dropped into this environment and are told to just cause as much chaos as possible. The game is very point driven. I know that's something that's forgotten these days in gaming, but there's points here. You want to try to get as many points. There's even like a little mode where you can get like quests from people, but really it's all the same gameplay. You just go around beating up everybody or eventually finding a gun and killing them. I know I basically just said the same thing twice, but that's really all you do in this game. And the game has aged. And the beat 'em up gameplay, it's aged. It's not the best. Coming back all these years later, it's a bit difficult. The Warriors and Bully have much better beat 'em up gameplay than this game did. It's very clunky. The controls are kind of shoddy. It's really unrefined. And when you get a gun, usually it's just pretty terrible all around. I mean, the camera is just awful, and you're just kind of shooting into nothing, hoping that you spray and pray, essentially. It is kind of difficult to come back to in that sense, but if you can get a grip on the controls, I mean, what you have here is a decent enough time. The game isn't exactly very long. You can probably finish everything in a few hours, but it is pretty goofy, and just going around mindlessly destroying everything and causing chaos is always going to have its fun in a Rockstar game. Now, I'm not going to tell you to go seek the game out or anything, but if you see it for a couple bucks at like a garage sale or a flea market, maybe it's worth trying. I remember seeing this game in the bargain bin for like over a decade, so there's no way it's worth like anything. Interestingly enough, there actually was a sequel to this game, but it is not by Rockstar Games, and that's why it's not here and I don't have any experience with it. But State of Emergency, everybody. And so here we have like the strangest game on the list. We have Rockstar Games presents Table Tennis, mostly developed by Rockstar San Diego and released on the 360 in 2006 and a port to the Wii in 2007. I remember playing this on the Wii way back in the day, and I really still don't understand why Rockstar Games made a table tennis game. I'm pretty sure this game was made to just kind of test the Xbox 360 with Rockstar Games and their engine, but looking back, I'm just like, why? Why would they test it with a table tennis game and not, I don't know, like any of their other properties? Well, regardless of that, what we have here is a very serious, realistic, simple, but difficult to master table tennis game. As someone who thinks table tennis is like kind of fun, especially with friends and just kind of casually playing it, there's some enjoyment to be had here. This is without a doubt the best table tennis game I've ever played. It's certainly way better than Wii Plays Table Tennis, and it has a lot more going on. It's very realistic. There's a bunch of different moves you can actually execute, and it can get, again, very serious with really long rallies. I remember on the Wii there was a couple different control schemes, and I remember it being pretty decent for the most part, but if you're going to play it nowadays, you're really going to want to play the Xbox version. It even works on Series X, and it's table tennis. If you're going to play a table tennis game and not just, I don't know, real table tennis, you're going to be playing this game. This game kind of blew people's minds back when it came out, and it's still a very solid table tennis game. It's still a very solid sports game, but when you compare it to all the other games on this list, there's a reason it's not all that high. But it is a good game. It is a good sports game. Very rare nowadays, I know, but good game nonetheless, and we like those. So here we have Smugglers Run 2 Hostile Territories, released by Angel Studios in 2001 for the PS2 and 2002 for the GameCube as Smugglers Run War Zones. Now, while the original Smugglers Run felt very similar to Midnight Club Street Racing, Smugglers Run 2 feels very similar to Midnight Club 2. The handling is a hell of a lot better than the original games, and the physics are all around just much more refined and better and less unpredictable. Now, they actually address some of the issues I had with the first game. First off, the environments are way better than the first games. They're a lot less drab and flat. There's a lot of verticality here. There's a lot going on. You'll go through valleys, you'll go up mountains, you'll go down mountains. It actually reminds me a lot of the game Fuel, if you remember that from Codemasters. I really loved Fuel, and I don't know, I just got Fuel vibes from this, and it was actually pretty decently done, the environment. And when it comes to what you're doing in the game, it is pretty similar to the first game. You're doing races, you're going checkpoint to checkpoint, you're doing the smuggler runs, and of course you're trying to get away from the police. The police are not as bad as they were in the first game, where they just wreck your shit in like a second and you gotta just completely start over. Oh, there's still a lot of trial and error here. It's still pretty egregious by today's standards, but it's nowhere near as bad as the first. The first game was just sometimes unbearable with how bad the police were. But yeah, I like the variety, I like the environments, I think the cars handle pretty alright for the most part, and I think that this is actually a decent game. It's a decent improvement on the first game also. Would I recommend it above any of the Midnight Club games? Yeah, no, I would not. I would say go play any of the other Midnight Club games. But again, fun, decent little game. I can recommend it if you like driving games, and what you get here, yeah, it's a pretty decent time. So here we have the original Midnight Club Street Racing, released in 2000. It was a PS2 launch title developed by Angel Studios, who would go on to become Rockstar San Diego. And while I think the original Midnight Club is fun, it hasn't aged all that gracefully. Plot, if you can even call it that, was as basic as it gets. It's just about a bunch of urban street racers known as the Midnight Club who race for pride, power, and glory. The main gameplay loop is actually incredibly basic. You really just drive around this kind of open area and look for other people to race. They're marked on your map, you drive up to them, you flash your lights or honk, and then, yeah, you just end up racing them, and that's the whole game. It's just a series of races. Sometimes you race one person at a time, sometimes you race 5 people at a time. There's really not all that much to it. You just race, and you get new cars as you race, and eventually you go through a couple different locations, and you do the same thing at all those locations. You just race. The driving in this game is alright. I mean, it gets totally blown away by the other Midnight Club games, but this is serviceable. It's fine enough. The physics, I will say, are kind of wonky. It can feel a bit clunky sometimes when you're doing like big turns, and the physics overall can be just kind of questionable. And then on the topic of questionable, we have the AI, which has plenty of rubber banding and can also be kind of questionable, where it just magically catches up to you at the very end. But the driving seemed fine enough. The presentation was alright. Also, everything looked decent enough. The music, sadly, is just totally forgettable. I couldn't even tell you any of the music in this game. And I thought the frame rate was also kind of suspicious. It did drop sometimes when things were getting a little crazy. And yeah, Midnight Club 1 is pretty alright. It's pretty short. I beat it in one night, maybe like 4 or so hours. And I mean, it was the one that started the series, but nowadays I can't really recommend anybody come back to it. I mean, you can get it dirt cheap, but you might as well just play the other Midnight Club games. And here's another game that's different from the rest. Here we have Oni, developed by Bungie, actually, of Halo fame, and published by Rockstar Games in 2001 for PS2 and Windows. Now, Oni came out just before Halo 1, so Bungie was not a household name yet. They were still, relatively unknown. They had some good games under their belt, but they weren't, superstardom level where they are now with, say, Destiny or some of the later Halo games. Oni is a very different type of game. It is a focused, single-player, third-person action game with a lot of anime aesthetics and an anime kind of setting in general. It's very similar to Ghost in the Shell. It reminds me a lot of Ghost in the Shell, and I feel like that's what they were kind of going for. The game's plot is pretty generic, though. It's a plot to stop an evil organization, and that's really all it amounts to. There's not all that much to it. At least the main character looks pretty cool. The game is a brawler-shooter hybrid. It feels a bit like a beat-em-up, but in like 3D. Combos are very fluid, and they look and feel really good. Like, even nowadays, I'm like, wow, the animation is actually superb in this game. And yeah, beating fools up, it actually is decently fun. But it wouldn't be a Bungie game without guns. Now, you do get guns in this game, and the shooting, it's actually really awkward. It's really clunky, and honestly, it's just kind of questionable. I didn't find the shooting to be all that good in this game. When you're just in hand-to-hand combat fighting 1, maybe 2 enemies at a time, I think it is actually pretty solid. The combos are good. There is a lot of useless ones, but everything flows really well, and like I said, the animation is pretty good. Enemies can absolutely kick your ass. Sometimes the enemies just wipe the floor with you and your character takes forever to get up or react. I really wish there was a block button in this game because the combat can actually get pretty frustrating, especially when there's more than one enemy that you're fighting in hand-to-hand. But once you get pretty into the hand-to-hand combat, you learn some of the combos and it's, again, one enemy. It can actually be a pretty good time here. It is very interesting. The levels are all really basic. For the most part, it's just go from point A to B, occasionally interacting with the environment and just fighting pretty much everything along the way. However, some of the levels really just kind of go on and on. They really drag, and some of them are really just bland and uninteresting. Like, there's just not a lot going on here with some of these levels. But for every level that's not that good, there's usually like 2 or 3 that are pretty decent. The lack of music for the most part doesn't help things either. Like Halo, music only plays at important parts in the level rather than the whole level, just kind of adding to that bland, almost boring feeling. I remember playing this a long time ago and thinking it wasn't very good, the controls were awkward and the levels were boring, but coming back to play it nowadays, I think it is pretty alright and I can appreciate it for what it is. I know the game has a decent fan community and there's a lot of patches to get it working on modern computers, and you know, if what you see here interests you, I think you ought to try it out. It is very different from not only every game on this list, but what Bungie has made. It's a very interesting game, but it was a little ahead of its time. Again, the combos and the animations are pretty good. The game is clunky by today's standards, but I think it is worth trying to some extent. Alright, and so here we got Midnight Club 2 by Rockstar San Diego. Now, Midnight Club 2 is actually a pretty big improvement on the first game in a number of different aspects. The plot, exactly the same as the first game, where you're just racing a bunch of elite racers around a couple cities, this being LA, Paris, and Tokyo, but it does have some fun characters thrown in there, and the voice acting is pretty cheesy and pretty silly for the time. But the general gameplay has been refined by quite a bit. Yes, the main gameplay hook is you drive around an open area, honk or flash your lights at people and race them, but it has been improved in a number of different ways. First off, the worlds, the open worlds that you actually drive around in, are much better than the first game. The first game had very flat, boring maps. This game, not like that at all. These maps have a ton of detail, there's a bunch of shortcuts, alleyways, slopes, declines, and there's just a lot more to these maps that make the racing a lot more interesting. There's also more than just like one racing type. There's a bunch of different racing types to make different types of events. Sometimes all the checkpoints you have to race to are not in order, so you have to drive around the map and try to figure out what the fastest route is, and that can lead to some crazy experimentation. The cars control great. The controls are just great in general. The cars feel a lot better. They're super light. They can turn on a dime, and it really fits the Midnight Club aesthetic. It is super arcadey. I mean, you can even control the cars in midair, and it introduced a few of the Midnight Club techniques that would become a staple of the series. The game also introduced bikes, and there is hang time. I never really use these bikes because I just crash my car too damn much. You're going so fast in this game. And speaking of going fast, by the end of this game you are going blistering fast, and this game actually gets really freaking difficult. Like, I was kinda shocked with how difficult Midnight Club 2 gets. I was like, holy shit, I've been on this race for like 45 minutes. This is hella hard. I'm not this awful at the game. Like, the AI are stupid good. There's tons of cars in the way. The vans, the minivans, they always get in your fucking way, and you just hate the minivans. No, Midnight Club 2 is not messing around. It is actually a very difficult game. One thing that wasn't totally improved from the first game is the customization. I think it's pretty lacking and very basic in Midnight Club 2. It's like you can change the color. Cool. I will say the music though, the music is pretty great in Midnight Club 2. I would say it's a solid improvement from Midnight Club 1. That's really all I can say about Midnight Club 2 in general. Is just it's a very nice improvement on the first game, and I can actually recommend it. And so here we have Red Dead Revolver, the first of the now very popular Red Dead series, developed primarily by Rockstar San Diego, and it was released in 2004. Red Dead Revolver is a very different type of game from pretty much all of Rockstar Games' games, especially the Red Dead Redemption games. It is very different. It is almost nothing like it, actually. The only thing that this game really has in common with the Redemption games is the setting and everything that brings, and I guess the Deadeye mechanic. This game does not try to be a cinematic open world masterpiece. It is just not like that at all. It is a very arcade oriented linear shooter where it really feels like a shooting gallery. Everything from the controls, the levels, the weapons, it's all very arcade. The game is incredibly level oriented and you move through very linear levels. You get dropped into these levels and your goal is basically the same for almost every level. You want to shoot and kill everything that moves. You get a variety of weapons in the game. You get to actually choose your loadout for most of the levels. You don't have regenerating health, and yeah, you're just blasting everybody. The story of the game takes place in the 1880s, and it follows bounty hunter Red Harlow in his quest for revenge after the murder of his parents when he was just a child. You play as a couple other characters throughout the story, but it really is all about Red, and the story can sometimes feel a bit segmented, but it all comes together pretty nicely, actually. Now, since you're shooting people most of the game, how is the shooting in this game? Well, the shooting can take some time to get used to. It does feel a little clunky, it doesn't feel as smooth as you'd like it, but again, you can actually get pretty used to it. At least the gunplay is relatively satisfying. A lot of the weapons have a good kick to them, and it is satisfying to just totally blow someone's brains out with like a revolver. I do wish the weapons felt a little more different from each other though. This game also has Deadeye, where everything goes into slow-mo and you can target certain body parts and then just totally blow someone away, which it was cool then and it's still cool now. The game also has duels where you gotta draw and shoot faster than your opponent, and these start out fine enough, but they actually get really challenging, especially towards the end of the game, and they can get a bit annoying, and I wasn't huge on them, they were just okay. But all in all, Dead Revolver is actually a really fun time. It is a very solid game, and it has a ton of personality and charm to it, whether with the quirky characters, crazy boss fights, or really just engaging levels. I actually do think it is worth playing. The presentation is pretty crusty, especially on the PS2, what I was playing it on, and it can be sometimes hard to see, it's so blurry. Especially the sunset levels where it looks like they're pouring Vaseline all over the screen. The frame rate can get pretty choppy when a bunch of action is going on as well. The game is readily available on PS4, so if you want to play it on a modern system, there's that, and I think it is a really fun arcade time.
Warriors, come out to play. Warriors.
And so like he implied, here's The Warriors, released in 2005 for the PS2 and the Xbox, developed mostly by Rockstar Toronto. And if you couldn't tell, this heavily plays off the 1979 film of the same name, which I went and saw the movie before I played the game, and you know, this movie's great. And regardless of whether you're going to play the game or not, I really do recommend the movie. The game, though, adds a bunch of lore and characters to the Warriors as a whole. It pays a ton of respect to the movie and offers a boatload of fan service. It's clear they watched and loved the movie. This isn't some crummy movie tie-in game. This is legit. They got as many of the original actors as possible to come back for their roles. They recreate a bunch of the scenes from the movies, if not just like almost every scene. The new stuff they add is pretty good, and there's some solid game mechanics here. When you're actually playing the game, it is a very solid beat 'em up. It's like Streets of Rage in 3D. While it's not amazing and it has aged in some aspects, this game was still a really fun time. You really just go around beating the absolute shit out of pretty much everybody. You're either beating the crap out of them or you're running away from them. There's some other stuff you do in this game, but really that's what you're doing most of the time. The game's beat 'em up mechanics are pretty fun, it's pretty solid, it's satisfying enough. It has aged, yes. Sometimes it can be quite a bit clunky. The camera's pretty awful for the most part. And some parts of the missions, yeah, they aren't so hot, they're not so good. Like spray painting in this game, yeah, no, this is just not very good at all. This was better done in Bully, and it wasn't even great there. And just to be 100, the cops are absolutely terrible in this game. It's like they took some notes from Smuggler's Run 1 and put it in here. Like they're just superhuman. They are way stronger than they should be. They will absolutely wreck your shit and try to arrest you like crazy fast. I mean, I know they were pretty good in the movie, but like, geez, dude, this is ridiculous. Any mission with the cops is just probably not going to be a very good mission. The boss fights are just all awful in this game. They're just terrible. They don't really use the game mechanics all that well, and some of them are just straight up atrocious, like the final boss. But regardless of those issues, we have one of the most underrated games and underappreciated games in the 2000s, honestly. This game is crazy forgotten. I don't hear like anybody talking about it, and that's a shame because when it comes to 3D beat-em-ups, this is really one of the best. The game has a great soundtrack. It is pretty much all the music from the movie, but it adds a bunch as well, and it's all superb. The atmosphere this game has is really well done. I really did like the atmosphere of the Warriors. And the game is easily one of the very best movie games ever made. It really pays a lot to the movie. It adds a lot to the movie. Again, it adds a bunch of lore and backstory and just characters. And I really did appreciate it. And maybe it was because I watched the movie first and then played the game, but I thought this game kicked ass. Yeah, it's rough around the edges. It's got some issues. It's not amazing by today's standards, or even back then it wasn't amazing, but it still is a really damn fun good time. And it's totally worth playing. It even had a decent PSP port, but again, totally worth playing, and the movie's totally worth watching too. Alright, and so here we have GTA Chinatown Wars, released in 2009, developed primarily by Rockstar Games. The game was originally released for the DS, but it would release for the PSP and the iPhone later. With the game being made primarily with the DS in mind, it does have some key differences between the other Grand Theft Auto games. It's much more like the first two GTA games where it is from a top-down perspective, but it has a lot of the modern elements from later GTA games. The game has a totally unique presentation as it is cel shaded and looks much more like a comic book, a first and only time the series has done this. However, the PSP version does not have this. I remember playing this game many years ago on my DS, on my R4, and then eventually picking it up on my iPhone when I was younger as well. And I remember being decently impressed with it. The game does utilize some of the DS's gimmicky elements such as the touchscreen and blowing into the mic, but for the most part you've got a real full-scale Grand Theft Auto game here. It's just top-down. It takes place in GTA 4's Liberty City, but it's obviously a lot more scaled back and smaller, and of course some compromises are going to be made here to the map and the world and the gameplay since it's on the DS, but again, I think that this is actually a pretty decent to good attempt at a Grand Theft Auto game on like the DS. The story is actually pretty unique too. You play as Huang Li, he's a Triad member, and you actually do a lot of drug selling in this game. And it goes over his struggles, especially with being in the Triad. I think it's actually pretty unique, especially for the GTA series, and it's honestly become kinda underrated. But yeah, when it comes to the gameplay, what you've got here is a typical GTA game. You've got a fully explorable open world where you take on missions and you can sell drugs. A lot of the missions are your standard GTA affair, and yeah, while it is from a top-down perspective, so it doesn't, control as nice or as engaging as, say, some of the other games, it's still actually pretty good. And I think the whole drug dealing aspect of the game is unique for the series, and it throws in a little wrinkle in there for the gameplay. I think that this is actually a pretty good game. It turns out that this is actually the highest rated DS game of all time, interestingly enough, and well, I don't know about that. I think that it is still actually good, and it is worth playing. I don't really love the top-down GTA games, but if you're going to play any of the top-down GTA games, this is the only one that I think is really worth playing nowadays. Okay, so here we got GTA Liberty City Stories, initially released for the PSP in 2005, but then put on the PS2 a year later. Now, Liberty City Stories was a big deal for the time as it was the first 3D GTA title to be released for handheld devices. All we had before was GTA Advance and the ports of GTA 1 and 2 on Game Boy. The game is a prequel to Grand Theft Auto 3 using the same setting, that being Liberty City. It takes place in 1998 and follows mobster Tony Cipriani, a character who is in GTA 3. And it's about Tony rising to power and becoming the mob boss that he is in GTA 3. The story is pretty decent in this game. I'm not going to act like it's amazing or these characters are all that memorable or it isn't, predictable, but it is actually pretty alright. Now when it comes to the gameplay, it really does play like the GTA games from the mid-2000s. It feels the most probably like Grand Theft Auto 3 since, it is the same city. And if you like the gameplay of the Grand Theft Auto games from the mid-2000s, as most people do, then yeah, you'll like the gameplay here. It does feel a little scaled back from, say, San Andreas, which this game came out after, such as you cannot swim at all. You'll just die if you fall in the water, but the game does have some indoor environments. GTA 3 did not have that, really. But when it comes to the missions, it definitely does feel a bit scaled back from San Andreas. Again, it was made for the PSP, and most of the missions are your standard GTA crime affair. There's nothing really here that stood out all that much to me. Most of them are pretty fine to good. There wasn't really any horrible ones, at least. When it comes to the controls, they feel just as good as the other PS2 GTA games. I've only ever played this game on PS2, so I only know that version. It feels fine, the cars control nice, and the shooting is pretty decent. Sadly, despite being pretty decent to good, I would say that Liberty City Stories is a bit unmemorable. It just doesn't have a ton going for it, and there's a reason most people don't even really talk about it nowadays. I mean, at least the radio stations were decent. It also doesn't have length on its side. It's maybe like 6 or 7 hours. If you explore everything, maybe you can add a couple more hours at most, but yeah, it's not that big either. Is it worth playing nowadays? Yeah, it's pretty alright still. Alright, so here we got GTA Vice City Stories released for the PSP in 06 and the PS2 in 07. Vice City Stories would be the last of the original GTA 3D series. After this we would get GTA 4, which changed to a much more realistic style. And like Liberty City Stories, this is a prequel, this time to Vice City Stories, and you follow Vance, a minor character in the original game. His brother, though, Lance, would be a much more integral character to Vice City. The story here is actually pretty decent. It's about the brothers conflicting with rival gangs, drug lords, and really just trying to, rise up in the criminal world. I think this game is able to capture Vice City's vibes really well. I love Vice City's vibes and characters, and I think that this game really does build off of that. It's not as good as Vice City, obviously, when it comes to the characters, world, story, and all that, but it still is pretty decent, and they actually do have something here. and I liked it. This game is much more in line with San Andreas in terms of improvements, like you can swim, you can fly airplanes, you can really interact with every type of vehicle that you could in San Andreas. And you know, when it comes to the controls, at least on the PS2 version, this might be the best of all the GTA PS2 games. It actually does feel pretty nice, it is smooth for the most part, and the combat does not feel anywhere near as clunky. I'm specifically referring to the hand-to-hand combat, which has been, quote, overhauled, as the developer said, and it does actually feel pretty alright. And then the game has absolutely what you expect. You can free roam around a pretty decently sized Vice City that does feel different from the original Vice City. You can do the main missions, or you can buy properties and expand your businesses like how Vice City did. I like the whole business thing to GTA. I've always thought that this is pretty neat. It is a bit expanded on here, and some of the side missions are actually pretty decent here. It's not all just throwaway filler. I like the whole beach patrol thing and where you would have to deal with these bikers on the beach, which was pretty funny. But in general, the side missions were actually pretty decent. The game is a bit longer than Liberty City Stories, and I thought that the campaign was just a bit more fulfilling. There's actually some memorable missions here in the main campaign, like the one with Phil Collins. I think everything to do with Phil Collins was actually pretty great here. I did like the campaign for the most part. I think that this is a pretty solid GTA game. When comparing all the GTA games, yeah, it is a little lower on the list, but it still is a pretty good game for the most part, and you should probably try it out if you like GTA. And so here we have Max Payne 2 by Remedy Entertainment. Max Payne 2 is a pretty good shooter with a great story. However, when it comes to all three of those Max Payne games, I do think it is the weakest of the three. The story is about Max, still a hard-boiled cop, going up against a group known as the Cleaners, and some other shit goes down that I won't say. A lot of the game also focuses around Max's new love interest, Mona Sachs, who is also a very strong character for the series. You even get to actually play as her in a few segments. However, I thought those were the weakest segments of the game. Max Payne 2 retains a lot of the great gameplay that made the first game so great in the first place. You go around shooting basically everything that moves. You have a ton of different weapons to kill all these bad guys with. You get to go into slow-mo and do some really cool looking Matrix style kills, and you go through some interesting set pieces. Now, while you got to do some really cool looking stuff in the original Max Payne, the second game just lets you go absolutely apeshit, as you can just be in slow-mo a ton of time. You can jump, run, spin, roll. You can do a bunch of stuff in slow-mo and be in it way longer. It lets you just go completely apeshit. And you look really cool doing it. I mean, this game makes you feel like a badass. That much is inevitable. However, the thing that keeps it from ranking any higher on this list, and the reason it's my least favorite Max Payne, is because it's actually the shortest Max Payne of them all. The game was maybe like 4 hours long, and I just wish it was longer so I could get more invested into the game. I mean, I had such a fun time playing the game. When it ended, I was like, wait, that's it? It's over already? I think the game could have easily gone on another hour or two and it wouldn't have dragged at all, but that's just me, and kind of like American Nightmare again, the game does reuse environments a few times. I mean, there's 1 or 2 environments you go to more than once, and I'm just like, the game isn't already that long, like, come on now. Still, if you're looking for an older, great action game that is on the shorter side, you can beat it in like a sitting or two, you can't go wrong with Max Payne 2, because it's a very good time. Alright, so here I got a double whammy for you. I got both the GTA 4 expansions here, both of them released in 2009 for the 360, and we have The Lost and the Damned and the Ballad of Gay Tony. Originally, I did have these two as separate entries, but no matter how I did this list, these two entries were always right next to each other, so I thought, might as well just put them together. Now, both these expansions are very similar in a number of different ways. Both of them take place in Liberty City. It uses the same map as GTA 4. Both of them take place during GTA 4, and both of them involve characters that were just side characters in GTA 4, but are obviously the protagonists for their own stories. And both expansions use GTA 4's gameplay, so that really heavy kind of underwater feeling that you get while driving around is very present here that I'm not a big fan of, and the shooting does feel very weighted and is very cover oriented, but it's still pretty good. Despite all those similarities, the stories are actually very different from each other. The Lost and the Damned is about Johnny Klebitz, who is the vice president of the Liberty City chapter of the Lost MC, a motorcycle club, and it's about Johnny's efforts to keep the chapter running while dealing with tons of internal conflicts, gang warfare, drug running, and all sorts of wonderful things. The Ballad of Gay Tony follows Luis Fernando Lopez, a former drug dealer turned bodyguard and best friend of Anthony Gay Tony Prince, a nightclub owner and high-status socialite in Liberty City. And the story really is about them staying afloat and keeping the club running. Both stories are actually pretty great. They both use GTA 4's excellent storytelling, and I think they both tell really good stories, and they have some of the strongest characters and writing that the series has ever seen. They also do shed some light on some of the other aspects of GTA 4's missions. Now, when it comes to which expansion I like more, I definitely like the Ballad of Gay Tony more. I like its story and characters more. I think Lost in the Damned has a pretty good story, and it does have some good missions to it. I just think Ballad of Gay Tony has better missions, better characters, better writing, and I just found it a little bit more enjoyable. But that doesn't discount the Lost and the Damned at all. I think both of them are some of the best expansions or DLCs made for any game. Like, they're both great. They're both at least 4 or 5 hours long. They, again, have a pretty good story. They have some pretty good characters, and the gameplay is pretty good still. Both of these expansions added a ton of vehicles and weapons and modes to the multiplayer, so they really did add more to GTA 4. They didn't just reuse all of GTA 4's stuff. Really, every expansion or DLC should strive to be as good as these GTA 4 expansions because they're just really good expansions. Like, if every expansion or DLC was this good, we'd be in a lot better world. World hunger would probably be solved. Or maybe I would have gotten my Tree 50 from the Loch Ness Monster. Either way, it's totally worth playing. If you like GTA, totally play these. If you like open worlds, play them. They're some of the best expansions ever. It's pretty hard to, like, get this without GTA 4 at this point, so, like, just buy it all together. It's totally worth it. And so here we have the game that really brought GTA into the limelight, that just kind of made it explode with popularity. Grand Theft Auto 3, released in 2001. Now, you don't need me to tell you how GTA 3 really revolutionized gaming, especially in the 2000s, and how it really just changed the game. It wasn't the first open world game by any stretch of the imagination, but it really popularized and pioneered the genre. Now, has the game aged? Of course the game has aged. It hasn't aged all that remarkably, but what you still have here is a more than fine enough playable experience in modern day. It still has everything that you're looking for in a GTA game, just on a smaller scale compared to some of the later titles. You've still got a sprawling open world with a ton of collectibles, side missions, and then you have all of the main missions, the storyline of GTA 3. The story follows Claude, a silent protagonist who is betrayed and left for dead by his girlfriend when they're robbing a place. And it really leads him on a quest for revenge that leads him to become entangled in a world of crime, drugs, gang warfare, and just straight up corruption. The story is actually pretty good in this game, especially compared to GTA 1 and 2. It's a lot more fleshed out. There's really, like, characters here with personalities. Are they over the top? Of course they're over the top, but they're still pretty solid. The writing is decent enough. Yeah, it is a bit more basic than the other GTA games, and your main character doesn't really have a personality, but I still think it is pretty good. Now, the biggest change that GTA 3 has over its predecessors is that it's a fully explorable 3D world. It's now in a third-person perspective rather than the top-down flat perspective, and everything is, again, in a third-person view. The progression has changed completely as well. The whole point system from 1 and 2 are just gone. Now you can explore to your heart's content. There's a bunch to see, a bunch to do, and you can just do the main missions whenever you want. There's no lives either. But these missions are just done so much better. They're much more engrossing. They have interesting points to them. They've actually got some real challenge to them, especially towards the end of the game. They're going to kick your ass. And I found most of them genuinely fun. Sure, there are some stinkers here, and in fact, there's actually a lot of stinkers here all these years later. But so many of these missions are just so memorable, like the car bomb mission. I love this mission, and the amount of different ways you can do it, it's pretty great, actually. Now, it's not all peaches and rosy here. This game has aged in a number of ways that make it difficult to come back to. The controls could definitely use some work. They take some time to get used to. They're very stiff, clunky, and shooting feels kind of terrible for the most part. Hand-to-hand is pretty awful, but at least the driving is actually pretty solid. It still feels really nice, and it is smooth. The driving is very arcade. It doesn't go for a realistic vibe here, and I actually still think it holds up really well. Most of the game you are driving, so that's good at least. You also can't swim, which is really annoying, especially for any missions on a boat. But yeah, don't be surprised if you have a number of deaths because you're fighting the awkward controls. Speaking of death, this game is not messing around. They have no problem kicking your ass. This game actually is pretty challenging, and if you don't use cheats, you're going to be on some of these missions a long time. But despite that, you have an absolutely legendary game here with a great open world, a nice storyline, some fun missions, and you can just have a great time playing GTA 3, whether it's 2001 or it's 2021, you're going to have a good time. And it's totally worth checking out the original version, I might add, not that shitty re-release from last year. And so here we got Midnight Club Los Angeles, the latest in the Midnight Club series, and this game came out in an interesting time in Rockstar's history. They were really shifting away from that cartoony arcade feel and were going for something a lot more detail-oriented, realistic, and sometimes almost simulation-based that Grand Theft Auto 4 really started, and Midnight Club LA, as a result, feels a lot more rooted than any of the other Midnight Club games, but it still is pretty crazy at times. It does still have all the Midnight Club staples though. You drive around an open world, this time being exclusively LA, challenging people to races. You start in this beater piece of shit car basically, and eventually upgrade your way up to nicer, cooler, better, faster cars with a ton of abilities like slowing time down, boosting, and even more. The story is actually different from the other Midnight Club games, particularly because there really is a story here. You play as an unnamed character who came from the Midwest. He comes to LA to be the best in the game, and he's just trying to race everyone and be better than everyone. There's a bunch of eccentric characters here to try to stop him or be friends with them, and yeah, he just races like everybody. And a lot of these characters, they're pretty goofy. They got some silly voice acting, and the writing can be a bit cringeworthy at times, but you know, I like the game's cheesy attitude. I won't lie though, a lot of times I did roll my eyes, especially at the main character, where I was just like, come on dude, really? Like, why even talking? I just would rather have nobody talk sometimes. Now, because this game is just LA and not a couple cities, Rockstar was really able to focus in on the detail and how realistic they wanted it to be to LA, and I gotta say, as someone who's been to LA a couple dozen times, this is very realistic to LA. I mean, aside from the traffic, you'd never move this fast in LA, no matter where you are or what time of the day it is, you will never move this fast. But in terms of how the locations are, yes, it is very close to LA, it's very detailed, and I can appreciate that. To be honest though, I would prefer multiple cities rather than one really detailed LA, but this is coming from someone who lives in California also, so take that with a grain of salt. This game is also the only Midnight Club game that lets you drive during daytime, which seems really counterintuitive to what Midnight Club is called. Seems pretty silly, but oh well. This game also has a lot, and I mean a lot more content than the other Midnight Club games. You do a lot more than just regular racing in the big open world here. There are tons of wager races you can make. You can actually do pink slip races. There's a lot of time trials. There's a bunch of different events here that are more than just driving up to somebody's car and honking at them and racing. It's actually pretty cool. And because of all this, this game is a lot longer than the other Midnight Club games. Like, it took me like almost 30 hours to beat. I didn't do like every mission either. I did most of them, but that is way longer than the other Midnight Club games. And just because it's way longer doesn't actually mean it's all that much better. I will be the first to say that the pacing in this game is not all that great. You are in the junker cars for way too long that feel very sluggish, and the beginning couple hours of the game, if not like beginning almost 10 hours of the game, do not feel anywhere near as fun as the other Midnight Club games. It's only the last like 5 to 10 hours where the game gets really fast, really crazy, doesn't feel sluggish, and just feels more like the old Midnight Clubs. Also, this game can feel very repetitive with how long it is and the fact that it's only the one map. Now, when everything clicks, when everything comes together, when you start going really fast, when you get a really fast car or a really fast bike, and by the way, the bikes rule in this game, way better than 2 and 3, and you know the map like the back of your hand, and you start getting to the fun, crazy events, this game really comes together, and it might be the most fun I've had with any of the Midnight Club games. Like, it really is that great when you're racing super fast towards the end of the game. It's a shame you have to go through so many hours of just kind of tedium and repetitiveness to get here, but where this is at the very end of the game, it's awesome. And the last thing I want to say is that the music is fantastic in this game, maybe the best in the whole series, and the customization and just car selection, superb. Great, maybe some of the best, if not the best, car customization I've seen in gaming outside of Forza Horizon. Despite my shortcomings with Midnight Club LA, it is a fantastic game that should not be missed if you love driving games, and it can be played on modern Xboxes. It's a shame that this is the last Midnight Club game, seemingly forever at this point, but yeah, totally worth playing. Alright, and so here we have Grand Theft Auto 4, released in 2008 for everything at the time. Now, GTA 4 really brought GTA into the HD era, and it changed a number of things for the formula. I'd say the two biggest changes that GTA 4 brought to the formula was that they made it a lot more realistic and heavy, and they actually have a much heavier emphasis on the story and the characters. Now, in the other GTA games, there were a lot of good characters and there was some good writing and some good story, but GTA 4 really hones in on the story, the writing, and its characters to create maybe the strongest cast of characters that the series has ever seen. The story is about Eastern European war veteran Niko Bellic and his attempts to escape his past. He leaves his country and comes to America to live the American dream, as his cousin Roman has said that he's living large in Liberty City. He shows up to find out that Roman is not indeed. And it sees Niko struggling with the idea of the American dream and of course falling into some bad shit and getting involved in some even worse shit. I think Niko Bellic is a really strong character, and I think that his whole character arc in GTA 4 is actually pretty great. The other characters in GTA 4 are also equally great. Roman, his annoying cousin, despite being annoying, is also pretty great, and the people that give you missions in this game, yeah, they're really memorable, and I think the story as a whole is probably the strongest aspect of GTA 4. It was the strongest story by far at the time for GTA games. Now, while I absolutely love the story of GTA 4, when it comes to the gameplay, I don't love it as much. Sure, the formula is generally the same. You have a giant, amazing open world to explore with a ton to see, side missions to do, and a nice storyline to go through. There have been some changes to the overall feel of the game that I'm not a fan of. I know some people really like how this game feels, but I just never have been a fan. Whether I played it back almost like 10 years ago or even nowadays, I'm just like, it's just not the best feel for me. See, this game has a very heavy feel to it. Everything feels a lot more weighted and just kind of rooted in reality. The older GTA games were a lot more arcade and just kind of crazy by comparison. First off, the driving I just feel is nowhere near as great as it was in the older games. It's a lot heavier, the cars feel kind of underwater, and turning in them just feels very slow. The game feels incredibly sluggish when you're driving around. You can get some good speed here, I'm not saying that, and you can actually go pretty fast, but it just doesn't feel that great to me. On foot, it's a pretty similar situation. You move very slow, it feels a bit sluggish and like you're moving underwater. The game introduces a cover system. It's a very good cover system actually, where you can take cover behind basically everything, and the shooting feels a lot more weighted and realistic. It's very heavy and a lot of the shots matter. When it comes to the presentation, this game looked freaking amazing for 2008, but you know what? It can look even more amazing if it didn't have this ugly ass filter on it. Yeah, it has some like 2008 Instagram filter on it, and I do not like this filter at all. There's mods on the PC version that get rid of it, and I think this game looks way better. And then we have the radio stations, which maybe it's just me and my preferences, but I do not like the music in this game. I just never thought it was all that great. Liberty Rock was okay, but the other stations I was just like, wow, this isn't great. Now I get it, everything I just talked about is subjective and I'm probably making it sound like I don't love the game. Well, despite my subjective issues with it, I don't think you can deny that the game has some superb missions. It has a ton of memorable set pieces, it has a ton of depth to it. Niko's very customizable, you can get a girlfriend, you talk to people on the phone. I really do actually think the gameplay is still really good. It's just not my preference for GTA. But I still have a ton of great memories with GTA 4, playing it back in the day, really liking the story, and actually really liking the multiplayer. I have a lot of fun memories in the multiplayer. It was really a good time. It's a shame you can't really go online with it anymore. I know I just talked shit about it for 2 minutes, but I still think that this is a great game that is totally worth playing if you like GTA open world games, or if you somehow haven't played it at this point. And so here we have one of my favorites on the list. We have Manhunt, released by Rockstar North for the PS2 in 2003. Manhunt is pretty different from all the other games on this list, minus Manhunt 2, and it's violent. Oh, is it violent. The setup is one of the most twisted setups you'll find in any video game. It's about James Earl Cash, a death row prisoner who is forced to participate in a series of snuff films, earning his freedom by murdering criminal gang members sent to hunt him on camera. Yeah, you're really participating in snuff films, and the people you're killing, these gang members, are not good people. These are some messed up, really messed up, fucked up people. Skinheads, neo-Nazis, cult members, yeah, it's not good people you're killing. You're not a good guy either, but you're better than these people. The story, the setup, and the atmosphere of Manhunt are just fantastic. Like, this game is really gritty, dark, serious. Yeah, it's not messing around, and I really do enjoy the atmosphere. It really does actually have a horror atmosphere, and never has a game been able to recreate this atmosphere, or even anything close to this atmosphere. I know a lot of people consider this game a horror game. I would say it certainly is a psychological horror game because it really just does have such a foreboding atmosphere, but the actual gameplay is pretty solid. And coming back all these years later, yeah, it can be a bit clunky, the controls can be a bit stiff, and it can take some time to get used to it, but once you get over that initial hurdle, I think it's great, and it's much better than the sequel. Most of the game is a stealth game where you're going through these dark urban environments, just hiding in the shadows, basically silently taking out all the other gang members and just trying to get the hell out of there. I think the game's stealth mechanics are actually really good and somewhat underrated. I know a lot of people go, oh, you're just hiding in the dark, but it's actually a lot more than that, and there is a bit of depth here. Additionally, the AI is actually really good in this game. They're really good at spotting you in the dark, they won't mess around, and they're not stupid either. But man, when you're able to sneak up on somebody and perform one of those executions, it is a violent, violent time. Like when you get the plastic bag and you choke someone out, like there's not many games where you can do some messed up crap like that. And you get plenty of different weapons to use in this game. And of course, if you're spotted, you can get into a fist fight or, a melee weapon fight. And these are fine enough. I'm not going to act like it's great. It's probably better than 2s, but you really want to avoid these. And then occasionally, you do get firearms and you get into a gunfight. And these honestly aren't that good, but I mean, it's pretty uncommon. A majority of the time you are hiding in darkness, taking people out slowly and going through these really dark, depressing levels, and I gotta say, it's a really good time. Like, I was glued to my seat with just how immersed I was in this game and its mechanics. A lot of the levels are actually really well designed and have a lot of intricate routes and really set up some interesting scenarios for you to go against these messed up individuals. And this game is just unforgettable. It truly is one of those unforgettable games from the 2000s where it's just like, how did they even make this? Like, I get it, they made Grand Theft Auto, but this is way more messed up on so many different levels. But if you can stomach the game's violence, I absolutely recommend you try it. Like, I think it just is, again, an unforgettable experience with an amazing atmosphere, pretty solid gameplay, but it just has so much going for it. So here we have the awesome original Max Payne by Remedy Entertainment. Not only do I think it's the best of the Max Paynes, but it tells such a gripping narrative that is full of so many different emotions, whether it's hate or anger or depression and sadness. Like, I really thought the story of Max Payne was great. The way it was told with these comic book style like screens I thought was always great. Sure, it does look a bit outdated now and some of the faces look pretty goofy, but the gameplay absolutely holds up and the story is just as impactful now as it was 20 years ago. The story just really involves Max going through a lot of deep shit and a lot of bad stuff. I mean, his whole family was killed. He's trying to deal with his past. He's an alcoholic. He's addicted to painkillers. Like, there's a lot of stuff going on here. It's a lot of baggage to unpack. And, I think it was really well handled. I think the voice acting is excellent. The production value, even back then, the production value was great. And yeah, while the world isn't as interesting as some of these other games like Quantum Break, I still think the story was very well done. But the gameplay is just superb. It is one of the finest third-person shooters you will find from the 2000s, if not of all time. Max Payne was really the game that took that whole Matrix slow-mo jumping into the air and shooting people and it looking awesome into games. And ever since then, there's been tons and tons of games that have copied from this. You just have a complete arsenal of weapons, you take painkillers to heal, and you run around in slow-mo or jumping around in slow-mo, just shooting everyone, gunning everyone down, and it's a great time. The levels are great, the level design is superb, everything makes sense, killing the enemies is extremely satisfying, the AI is pretty alright, and the flow of the game is just great. The general pacing is very well done. It is very cinematic, especially for the time, and the game has a great length to it. It's not too short, it's not too long, and it ends at like the right time. I really enjoyed my time with Max Payne. I think it's a true certified classic. I don't think anyone will deny that. And it's apparently getting a full-blown remake by Remedy sometime in the future, so we'll see how that goes, but you should totally play this. Alright, and so here we got my favorite Midnight Club 3, one of the greatest racing games ever made. And when it comes to street racing games, it doesn't really get any better than Midnight Club 3. It's fantastic. The story is about as basic as Midnight Club 2. You just really want to be the best and race the Midnight Club people or race the elite people or whatever. The game has San Diego, Atlanta, and Detroit as maps. And there's also Tokyo as a bonus if you have certain versions of the game. Each map feels decently detailed, not as much as LA of course, but it still feels more detailed than Midnight Club 2 with a bunch of nooks, crannies, shortcuts, jumps, etc. And I really did like all three of the maps. I thought they were all pretty good. Tokyo really is the Midnight Club 2 map just thrown in there with some new races, but I mean, I'm not going to count it too much. It's a total bonus and it's not even part of the main story. The game is a pretty decent improvement from Midnight Club 2 and improves on just about everything from Midnight Club 2. The first thing they looked at was the customization, because it was really weak in the first two games. It's really strong in Midnight Club 3. It's not as strong as LA's, but it is actually quite good in Midnight Club 3, and you can get some really cool looking cars here. The vehicle selection is actually quite good in Midnight Club 3, and this game would also bring back all the techniques from 2, including the boost, and would introduce some of the superpowers that would go on to be in LA and eventually Grand Theft Auto 5, like slowing everything down so you can drive through some of the traffic when you're just going at an insane speed. This game has a very good sense of speed. In fact, it is probably the best sense of speed in maybe the whole series, tied with LA. However, unlike LA, you have that sense of speed almost immediately. Like, even the slowest cars in this game still feel pretty fast, and you still go at a pretty high speed, and the controls are just great. It feels super arcadey still, and the cars can turn on a dime, and I just really had a blast going through this map as fast as possible. There's a lot more variety in the racing as well. There's different types of racing. There's a bunch of side races you can do, side bets you can do. You can make a bunch of money from doing these. The game is probably almost twice as long as Midnight Club 2, and really it's as long as you want it to be, and it doesn't go on too long either since a lot of it is optional. And while the game does get challenging, in fact near the end it gets very challenging, I don't think it gets to Midnight Club 2's level, and I don't think the AI cheat as bad as they did in 2. The rubber banding isn't as crazy and ridiculous here. And the presentation is also very strong. It looks quite a bit better than Midnight Club 2. And it is cool that they tried to add in weather effects like fog and rain, but unfortunately the rain just kills the frame rate in this game, and it makes it way harder when you're driving in the rain. Something about Rockstar Games and rain, I swear, they just can't get it right, any of these games. Then the soundtrack, yeah, the soundtrack is pretty fantastic. It's probably tied with LA for me in terms of which one I like more, but I do love that main theme. Cars real big, house real big, all that stuff. That one's big, that's a good one. But Midnight Club 3, you really can't go wrong with it. It just does everything right for a driving game. If you even casually like driving games, this is just must play. I've always had such a fantastic time with Midnight Club 3. What a great time. And so here we have the absolute fan favorite Bully, developed mostly by Rockstar Vancouver and released for the PS2 in 2006 and then other platforms till about 2008. Now Bully, like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, was actually the last Rockstar game I needed to play, and wow, I really saved one of the best for last because this game was great. I remember people talking about Bully a bunch when I was growing up, but I just never got around to playing it until now. And you know, a lot of people called it GTA for kids, and I kind of agree. It is kind of like a kid version of GTA, but it definitely has its own identity, its own gameplay formats, and a pretty unique story. The player controls Jimmy Hopkins, who is a delinquent who gets sent to this boarding school by his stupid mom and his even stupider stepdad. And he faces a lot of challenges that a kid, you know, going to high school at this time would face. A lot of bullying, a lot of assholes, teachers are terrible, and he's just trying to, you know, get through school and just get along. The story is great. These kids are awful. They are just little dickheads, and Jimmy really does put a lot of them in their place. They really just are terrible human beings in a typical Rockstar fashion, and it's pretty great to see them here also. I really like how the game progresses. I like the gangs, and I really just, again, loved the vibe, the atmosphere, the story, all of it. I thought it was great in Bully. But when you're actually playing the game, it does play a bit like a typical Rockstar game. It is an open world area where you can explore, you can do side quests, you can do the main missions, and you can of course just cause chaos. Obviously it's on a much smaller scale since you are just a high school student, but there really is a lot more to it. You can help other students, you can go to class, you can of course just mess around in the city and do whatever you want. And there are an absolute ton of memorable missions in this game, like dozens of memorable missions where I just can immediately call back to it. I also did just play the game, but I can immediately call back to it. Jimmy has a great arsenal. He has like a skateboard to get around. You can steal bikes. You can use a slingshot. Or you could just be a bully and beat the piss out of everybody. And you know, the combat is actually pretty decent. It's like the Warriors, but it's honestly better than the Warriors. It's a lot smoother, there's more combos, and it feels like a beat 'em up in 3D. I actually thought it was really satisfying, and there's a bit of depth to it. And when you aren't going to class or beating up people, you're exploring the open world, you're seeing what there is to offer. There's a ton of collectibles, there's a bunch of side missions, there's other challenges like races to do, and I actually thought the open world was pretty good. It does seem a bit small at first, but you realize that just because it's a little smaller doesn't mean it isn't full of detail. It really does have a ton of detail to it, and I really could appreciate it. And while we're finishing up here, I'd say the bosses are actually some of the best Rockstar Games has ever made. They're actually pretty good and way better than the Warriors. And then the music, oh my gosh, man, I had no idea how good the music was in Bully. Like, the music slaps so hard, it is so good. I was like, oh my god, oh my god, oh my god. This music is great. Like, I love the music. I thought the presentation was very good. The voice acting was just as good as I'd expected from Rockstar. Bully, there's a reason it's like the fan favorite when it comes to Rockstar Games during this period, because it really is fantastic. I have nothing but very high praise and recommendations for Bully. It's just very good in almost every level. It's totally worth playing. Here we got Vice City, released a year after GTA 3. Really looked at GTA 3 and its gameplay and its story and thought, how do we improve on this? How do we make it better? We set it in the 80s, we set it in Florida, and we just kind of expand the gameplay. And with that, I think they created a fantastic game. Vice City has gone on to be one of the fan favorites of the series, and a lot of people's favorite like PS2 game of all time, and with good reason. Vice City is just a fantastic game. The game is set in 1986 in the fictional Vice City, based on Miami and Miami Beach. It's about Tommy Vercetti and his rise to power after being released from prison and becoming caught up in an ambush drug deal. While he seeks out those responsible, he slowly actually builds up a criminal empire, taking power from other criminal organizations throughout the city. Tommy is a great character. He's one of the best protagonists of any open world game, let alone the GTA games. The previous protagonist, Claude, really didn't have a personality. He didn't have much going for him. Tommy is the exact opposite. He has a ton of personality and character and charm and wit. He's actually really well written, and there's a lot to him. He doesn't change a ton throughout the game, but you really actually root for this guy. But he isn't the only good character in the game. There's my man Lance, he's pretty good, and then there's a bunch of other quirky, memorable characters that give you missions throughout the game. I think the story of Vice City is just great. Sure, is it a little simple and is it based off Scarface to an extent? Of course, but it's still pretty great, and it still does tell an interesting story that makes you really, again, root for this guy and you want to see what happens. Now, while the core gameplay is still very similar to GTA 3, you have a giant open world to explore and you do a lot of driving and getting into some shootouts, the vibes and the missions are just totally different from GTA 3. Like, Vice City has some of the best vibes you'll find in any PS2 game. You really do feel like you're in like Miami Beach. The open world is just completely different from really any other GTA game. There's so much water, there's beach, there's just a bunch to this world. There's a bunch to see, a bunch to explore, and there's a bunch of nooks and crannies. In GTA 3, you couldn't really go in any buildings. In Vice City, you can. And then speaking of buildings, there's actually a whole property system here. Throughout the game, you'll actually acquire a ton of money, and you'll be able to buy businesses. And by buying these businesses, you'll be able to build up Tommy's enterprises. But of course, you're going to have people go after you if you become, a powerful figure. This game has a ton of different gangs in it, and they are way more interesting than GTA 3's gangs. And of course, you're going to get into fights with them. The combat and controls feel a lot better than GTA 3's, especially when it comes to the gunplay. The lock-on is quite a bit better. It's a lot smoother. It actually locks onto what you want. The weapons feel a lot better. They added a bunch of new weapons here. The melee, though, yeah, the melee's still ass, but the controls feel a bit better. You still can't swim, so that sucks. And the driving feels pretty much untouched. A lot of the vehicles feel the same, and the driving, again, still pretty arcade, but it is still good. And then when it comes to the missions, oh, it's so much better than GTA 3. They're a lot more memorable, there's a lot of variety, and it's a lot more than the simple kill someone, run someone over, or chase someone down. There's a ton of different missions here. There's heists, and you get to even control some RC planes and helicopters and things like that. These are terrible, but the ratio of good to bad missions is pretty good. Most of the missions are pretty great, and only a couple of them have aged poorly. This game has actually aged incredibly well in just about every aspect. Sure, it does look a bit blocky, but I mean, you can get over that. And it doesn't matter how old this game is, it's going to have one of the best soundtracks to any video game. It is arguably the best radio stations of any Grand Theft Auto game, and it's one of my favorite soundtracks to any game. Like, it is just fantastic. And the controls, like I mentioned, they've actually aged pretty decently. And yeah, it's just a fantastic game and totally worth playing no matter who you really are. If you like video games, it's, again, totally worth playing. Play the original version, don't play that awful remaster either. Okay, it was really hard to choose what the best game Rockstar Games put out in the 2000s were, but I really do think it is San Andreas. I think San Andreas is such an era-defining game of the 2000s, and I just think it's the best one. It's maybe the best game Rockstar Games has ever made. So with San Andreas, I can say the same thing about it that I said about Vice City. They look at the previous game and go, how do we make this even better? And you know what they did? They made just a fantastic game and one of my favorite games of all time. The game is about my man CJ Carl Johnson, who returns home following his mother's murder and is drawn back into his former gang and a life of crime while clashing with very corrupt authorities and just some really evil people. Carl's journey takes him across the fictional US state of San Andreas, which is the setting here. It's based on basically California and Nevada, and it has 3 major cities: Los Santos, which is LA, San Fierro, San Francisco, and Las Venturas, Las Vegas. I love the characters and the setting. I live in California myself. I've been to LA, I live near San Francisco, and I've been to Vegas a bunch, so you knew I was gonna love the setting like immediately. I love all 3 of these cities. They're all great, and this game is so much bigger than how Vice City was. Like, it is way bigger, and there's way more to see and do. And the characters really are just stuff of legends at this point. Like, they're all really great. CJ is a great protagonist, but it's not just him. The other characters are equally as good, like Big Smoke.
2 number 9s, a number 9 large, a number 6 with extra dip, a number 7.
And something I really like about San Andreas' story is that it has really strong antagonists. Like Tenpenny, I really hate Tenpenny, and I think that it has some of the best antagonists in the whole series. Okay, aside from the really awesome story, characters, and setting, we got a pretty great game here. It really does feel very similar to Vice City, but they expand on it in a number of ways. First off, the controls are a little bit better and smoother than Vice City's. The lock-on is even better than it was before. The gunplay is actually pretty satisfying, and the melee combat, well, it's not as awful as before. There's a ton of different weapons to use here, a lot of them being new to the series, and again, it all does feel very nice. It feels really snappy, and it does feel pretty arcade for the most part. Driving feels just as great as ever. They really did try to make some of these cars feel different, which is nice, and I can appreciate that. And on that note, you can actually swim in this game. If you go in the water, you don't die instantly. You can actually swim around. CJ can also climb stuff. I'd say the biggest change to San Andreas from the previous couple games is the level of customization that you have. This game is very customizable. In the old games, you could customize it the most, like what shirt your character's wearing. Here, you can customize everything about CJ, from his hair, how he looks, tattoos, and then they also bring in the role-playing elements. See, CJ has stats. He has stats in areas such as driving, firearms handling, stamina, lung capacity, and of course his hand-to-hand combat. The more you do of these actions, the better the stat gets. For instance, if you drive around a ton, your driving is going to get better. You're going to be able to handle cars better. If you run around a bunch, your stamina is going to get better. If you take CJ to the gym, he'll get fit and big. Or you can have him eat a ton of food and be lazy, and then he'll also get big, but not the kind of big that's muscly. You can even customize how CJ responds to pedestrians. It's not just CJ you can customize, as you can also customize your cars. There is way more vehicles here than any GTA game prior, and you can customize them pretty decently, like Midnight Club. And then there's all the gang activities. The gang stuff has been really expanded on from Vice City. You can actually take over territories, and you gotta protect your territory from other gangs. You don't have to do any of this, but it's fun. And then of course there's the main storyline to play through, and I think the main storyline's pretty great. It might be the longest of the GTA games. It has the most missions, and these missions are incredibly varied. They're all really different from each other, and so many of them are just memorable. And of course a ton of them have a decent amount of challenge, like the train. Some of my favorite missions of any video game are in San Andreas, like where you steal the jetpack or you do the heist on the casino. Like, I think all of these are just great. Sure, there's a bunch of missions here that are shit, I won't lie to you. A lot of the missions in San Fierro are not very good, especially anything involving drones. Like, these have just not ever been good in Rockstar Games. But for the most part, it feels like almost legendary after legendary mission, with so many good ones. And then the presentation was pretty good for the time as well. It does get really blurry on the PS2, and their frame rate isn't the best, but if you play like any other version other than the shitty remaster, it's fine. And the soundtrack, oh, it is so good. And the radio stations, oh my god, I could be here all day. I could really be here all day. I just love it. San Andreas also has the best cheats, easy. San Andreas is such a legendary game. It's probably my favorite PS2 game, like, of all time. Seriously, it's that good. And yeah, I've gushed enough about San Andreas now. Just a fantastic game, and I think everybody can agree that it is a great game. And that's really it for this video. I'd love to know what everyone thinks their favorite Rockstar games are from the 2000s. If you made it to this part of the video, comment cement. We're changing it up. No more bricks, cement. This video took a very long time to make. It was a lot of games. It was many years in the making as I was playing through all of these games, and I am just eternally grateful if you made it to this part of the video. If you could share it in any way or like it or, you know, comment or all that good stuff, I would, again, be eternally grateful. I have nothing but the biggest thanks for everyone who watches. I've definitely been going through some job crap lately, but I really appreciate everybody who made it this far. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed the video. I really do. It was, again, long time to make, but thank you. Everyone have a good one now. Bye-bye.